All right, good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us. I'm Rachel Flaherty, the Digital Services Manager at the VPA. Just a reminder, we have sessions today until 4 p.m., so check your email for your Zoom links, and you can head over to the VPA website conference page to see the conference schedule and register for any of the sessions available today. We also have a $20 gift card that we'll be randomly choosing a winner for at the end of the session, so make sure you stay for the end. You will be muted during the session, so if you do have any questions, you can type them in the Q&A section or chat box at the bottom, and our presenters will get to them at the end. We'd like to give a thanks to the Virginia Press Foundation for underwriting this session, and we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce our presenters, Trina Olson. She is the co-founder and CEO at Team Dynamics. She specializes in all things staff management, organizational strategy, and is an expert educator who has supported teams around the country to both improve their workplace culture and performance. And with her today is today is Pearl Dobbins, a senior strategist at Team Dynamics. She is passionate about the ways in which growth and engagement emerge from the combination of deep personal, relational, and cultural capacity building. So I'll let Trina and Pearl take it from here.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you all for having us. We are thrilled to be here today. You're going to learn a bunch about us over the next 45 minutes. One thing I do want to name, Pearl and I don't normally sound quite as sultry as we do today. We are both in recovery from COVID, but didn't want to miss being with you here today. A couple things to know about me. I studied rhetorical theory and rhetorical criticism. I've made my home in Washington, D.C. twice. I'm a two-time executive director. I'm white, I'm gay, and I'm 41. So all of those things are just true about my vantage point and how I come to the work. Pearl, would you be willing to introduce yourself briefly?
Absolutely. Thank you, Trina. So yes, I am congested. So I even sound funny to myself. So here's a little bit about me. I hold a master's degree in mental health, and I'm currently studying to become an Enneagram practitioner. I am a descendant of enslaved Africans. My pronouns are she, her. I navigate the world as a middle-aged woman in the vessel of a Black body. I'm also a daughter and a caregiver, and I serve as the caregiver for my aging mother that is partially able-bodied and partially not. Just to name this out loud, the truth is there are enormous gaps in how certain bodies are talked about and treated based on preferences toward or away from certain identities. So when we think about relationship plus communication across cultures, this requires us to choose to explore our own identities and our cultural programming and get way curious about the identities and cultural programming of others. So that's a bit about me and what we're going to be up to today. Trina.
So today is really about flexing our curiosity muscle. And we know in your industry, curiosity is really paramount. One of the ways that our biases and our programming seep into our work is we walk around as very smart adults with some kinds of feelings of certainty that maybe we shouldn't be having. So this idea of digging in to figure out how we can ask better questions more consistently, how we can work backwards from assumptions and programming and towards a real and right relationship. So when Pearl and I talk about real and right relationship, we mean telling each other the truth. We mean being consistent. We mean being values aligned and in our integrity. And then when we talk about communicating across culture, we're going to dig in a bunch on what that looks like, because culture in our world isn't in fact nebulous. It's actually pretty specific. And we can zoom in on patterns of thinking and behavior that are going to help us miss each other less when we're trying to understand, when we're trying to communicate, and when we're trying to tell stories.
All right, so to talk a little bit about who we are Team Dynamics. That's who we represent. Team Dynamics is a national strategy firm based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. What we have decided and what we have opted into and what we have signed onto is to do work in service of national workplace race and gender equity. The difference is currently making the largest difference in US-based institution. This point will come full circle toward the end of our presentation, so please stay tuned. So our practice at Team Dynamics is built on the foundation and research that mixed teams across ability, race, ethnicity, gender identity, class, faith, tradition, immigration experience, and more have the capacity to be more creative, innovative, impactful, if and only if that mix is both acknowledged and leveraged strategically. So we are a wonderful assortment of folks across mixed identities and folks that operate from the heart, mind, and body centers of intelligence. And as a choice and a practice on purpose, we leverage our blend of identities and experiences as a collective resource in pursuit of our goals because we know the mix can be magical. Next slide. So here's the lineup for our conversation with you today. We're going to offer up some concepts related to assumptions, to judgment, bias, and curiosity. We're going to share with you some strategies for building cultural curiosity. And then to bring it all home, we're going to explore how you can increase your confidence to build relationships with multiple cultural groups in communities that you care about. All right, next slide, Trina.
So the press in current context. Pearl and I really want to name that we know y'all have been going through it. Many of you have been in your industries for decades. Some of you might be newer to your industry. And we know for most of you, there's some sort of vocational pull, right? You are wanting to be part of a community that informs the public, that informs a democracy, that gives us the information we need to be good citizens to each other, right? And some of you may have felt surprised, unprepared, overwhelmed, and any mix of emotions, feelings, and experiences over the last 2.5+ years. As Pearl mentioned, we are based currently in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where George Floyd was murdered by police. So when we think of what it has been like to witness how people try to tell the story of what has happened on the ground here, we have been fascinated, right, by the depth, breadth, where folks have really gotten the stories right and where they've really gotten the stories wrong, right? And so we want to name that we are in, and we are aware we are in, a time when bodies are being politicized, whether or not people in their own bodies feel political. So we want to recognize that there is pressure from inside, from outside, a lot of people with big ideas about how you should be doing your job. And it's one of the reasons we're so grateful for associations like this, where you all get to come together as peers to really say, okay, what is true about our changing context? What are we going to need to get better at? What are we going to need to speak about with more ease? Where do we lack relationships and sources where we're going to need to build them to really understand the kind of organizing, the kind of lobbying, the kind of work happening in the streets and in neighborhoods and in communities? And so we just really want to acknowledge that, you know, there is a particular way that y'all have been experiencing your experience in the last 2.5 years. We want to offer you a couple pieces of a framework that feel really important to us. So when we think about part of how we are getting it wrong in the US over and over again, when we are talking about race, when we are talking about gender, when we are talking about violence, when we are talking about different kinds of communities trying to connect, is that oftentimes we are not doing as good of a job as we can at telling the truth. And you all have come really close to that understanding that multiple things are often true at the same time. So rather than falling for a false binary that there is a singular truth or a singular story or a singular right way, it's more often that there aren't even just two right ways. There are 6, 7, or more. There is a complexity. And part of what happens a lot is we avoid telling the truth by omitting speaking with specificity. We are talking around stuff, not about stuff. So one of the things we really offer as we think about flexing that curiosity muscle is to regularly ask yourself, is there anything else here that's true? How do I know? Who do I know it from? And how would I share it? The other thing we want to talk about is your own sense of responsibility. Some of you, depending on the bodies you come in, might think, oh, I should or shouldn't be telling this story. I am close to or far away from this lived experience. As a messenger with messages, what is my responsibility? What is my role about this story in this community at my publication, right? And so what Pearl and I invite you to do is regularly revisit and not think of your responsibility as static or singular, but think, okay, so for example, given the fact that I'm 41 and queer and white and a cisgendered woman, okay, cool. That's all part of how I'm coming to understand the story that's being brought to my attention. Okay, given that I have all of those facets of myself and I get different access to different people because of that, what is my responsibility this time with this story, given the team I'm on, who's here and who's absent? So think of your responsibility as living and breathing, and be tapping into options and opportunities that might be unique to you because of your mix. The third thing, and we know this is a very hot topic, is we actually talk in our book, The Hiring Revolution, a guide to disrupt racism and sexism in hiring, about the really long-held myth of objectivity. Here's what Pearl and I as practitioners know to be true about the brain science of bias. We are all being poured into all the time with messages about who's dangerous, with messages about who's the most likely to be a good leader, with messages about who's capable and less capable, right? Whether or not those messages are true, they're coming at us from everywhere. So we invite folks to, instead of attach to an idea that we can be objective, what if instead we held on to the reality that we are all coming with bias and programming all the time? So it's not about if, it's about how my programming and my lived experiences is influencing my ability to tell a story, to take in information, and to share it back out. So we invite the myth of objectivity to be the one of the things that maybe gets put to rest over the next couple of years, so we can have conversations about how we are all coming with incredibly subjective viewpoints. And then with those, not using those as an excuse or a weapon, what are we going to do now that we know our lived experience is influencing everything we're up to at work?
All right, here's a key concept we want to offer up. So each one of us is performing learned patterns of behavior. Yes, it's true. So whether in our awareness or not, we have culture. And here is the key definition, or the way we use to describe culture, that includes 3 key elements. So culture is 1, shared patterns, 2, that we use to make meaning, and 3, to determine what is and is not appropriate. Shared patterns we use to make meaning, to determine what is and is not appropriate. And here's a brief example. At one of my previous places of employment, in that work environment, if a person's office door was closed, it was inappropriate to knock on the door. A closed door in that work context meant that the person was in a session either with a client, in a supervision session, needing some uninterrupted dedicated work time, or they were simply in a meeting. And so in that environment, the pattern was to close the door if you were with a client in a meeting or needed dedicated work time. Okay. The meaning signaled that the person was unavailable. Okay. It was inappropriate to knock on the door, and it was absolutely appropriate to send the person an email, a text message, or a message via Microsoft Teams. Okay, so shared patterns we use to make meaning to determine what is and is not appropriate. Now we're going to layer on. Next slide, Trina. So hang on to this phrase. Everything is cultural. Either implicitly or explicitly, we have in our learning what behavior is appropriate or inappropriate across various contexts. And so I am making a significant assumption that many of you are beyond familiar with this image of an iceberg. And it is still very relevant and a very juicy image to speak to. And here's why. As you can visually see, if you have access to sight, there is way more below the waterline than above. And the vast majority of our cultural ways of being are not in our conscious awareness. So when it comes to relationships, especially across mixed identities, at times we can fixate on the more visible cultural cues, and we can totally miss the dynamic ways culture is happening below the surface. So here's a tip. Taking time to bring attention to what is below the waterline of visibility can be the difference, making a difference in terms of misunderstandings and also communication across culture. And so here's the rationale behind the tip. At times when we experience the behaviors or patterns of others, we can leap to meaning making and interpretation. And it can be easy for us to think or assume that we know what someone's behavior means. And to toss out a couple examples of elements below the surface, we'll use facial expressions. So you might observe Trina make a facial expression and then leap to deciding that you know what her facial expression means. Okay, also below the surface, incentives to work. A friend of mine serves as a director at a nonprofit community health center, and she is driven by justice and driven by closing inequity gaps. And she's also driven by the mission of the nonprofit. That is her incentive to work. It absolutely baffles her when someone purely wants to work for an exchange of a paycheck or purely work for benefits. And so what can happen, we can assume that the way we think or how we behave or what we perceive, we can assume that must be universal. And so the learning is, if we are deciding that there are only singular ways of being, we can slip into over monitoring behavior, and we reduce our ability to practice curiosity. And so the reality is, different people in different contexts and in different communities build and retain their patterns for different reasons. And when we're operating unconsciously, we can assume that the way I do things is the way other people should do things as well. And if we are holding a one right way mindset, we can actually miss that folks may have similar and different patterns of communication, similar different patterns of handling emotion, similar or different approaches to problem solving, similar or different meanings behind their facial expressions, and more. Okay, next slide, Trina. So it's no secret, our patterns of behavior come from somewhere. They were taught to us, sometimes formally and sometimes informally. We have learned what patterns are okay and not okay from someone and from some context. And so now we're going to shift to do a bit of self-awareness exploration by taking some time to think about, where might have I learned one of my patterns of behavior? Who taught me? How did they teach me? Was it directly, indirectly, explicitly, implicitly? Did they show me? Did they tell me? And so quickly, but we're going to zoom in on one specific one. Here are 5 places, spaces, or groups or roles that we think about that connect us to where we've learned or have learned some of our patterns of behavior. The first one being the place on the planet that you grew up. Different countries, different regions, different counties, different hemispheres have different patterns of behavior. Cultural patterns in New York are different than patterns in Montana. Patterns in Germany are different than patterns in the US. The neighborhood you grew up or are a part of or working in. Which county did you grow up in? Which county are you living in now, or do you work in now? And how has that county influenced the way you behave? What would be expected and what would be a surprise in that county context? Where you slept and took meals. For this, it's to be thinking about your earliest impressions of ways to behave. What were those patterns? What was okay and not okay? Groups that you may have belonged to. Groups might be formal, informal, small, large, organized, unorganized, membership-based or not. Could be singing groups, faith communities, writing or journalism groups, something you have felt connected to or feel connected to. And then lastly is your roles. And this could be personal or professional. Maybe you're an aunt, an uncle, a caregiver, a community organizer. Different patterns emerged based on the roles you are performing. And so Trina, this is unplanned, but as I'm looking at your face on the screen, I'm wondering, would you be willing to offer just a brief example of a pattern that you learned and where you learned it?
Yeah, I would be happy to. So part of what blows me away when we do this exercise is that reminder that it's not just my personality that has influenced the patterns, right, that I'm sort of most used to. And when I think of the neighborhood I currently live in, I think of the pattern of getting one another's packages off of each other's stoops if we think the other person isn't home. So this is a new pattern to me. This is not a thing I've ever experienced before. And when I first happened upon it, I was alarmed is probably too strong, but I felt like, whoa, okay, that's a thing we do. We like handle each other's mail. Isn't that illegal, right? I was like having some big feelings about it. But now I realize for the neighbor on either side of me, we're just in text message exchange about when somebody's going out of town. So it's not all the time. It's not every day. So I had thought maybe the pattern meant we're all looking at each other's mail every day. And I thought, I don't have time for that. How do they have time for that? But the reality is there's some paying attention about who's around and who's not, and who's been getting a lot of packages, and if it's going to rain or snow. And so now there's a pattern that's actually proactive about communicating when I'm going out of town, and about being willing to receive and ask for help when it comes to what's going on with the mail. So it's something that's new for me in the neighborhood that I'm in. And it doesn't necessarily mean we are friendlier or closer in relationship than other neighbors I've ever had. So as I also think about what does the pattern mean overall, so far it kind of means that. It doesn't mean a ton more than that. And when we think about what's appropriate or inappropriate, it would be that line of, you're grabbing my packages when I am home. Then I would start to say, hey, wait a second, I'm here, I've got it, right? So it's interesting to think about where we think of things as being polite or collegial or neighborly, and remembering that it might land on somebody a different way. And then as you negotiate together, what feels good and what feels tough about this, and how do we move forward?
Thank you, Trina. All right, so we want you to give this a try. We will give you about 60 quiet seconds or so to explore one of your patterns. In particular, we would like you to zoom in on your county, the county you grew up in, you live in now, or the county you work in now. Be thinking about, what is a pattern you were taught? Who taught you? How did they teach you? Were there rules? Did you learn by observing? Were you explicitly or implicitly taught how to behave? So hopefully you have access to something to write with or write on, and we want you to take 60 quiet seconds just to think of a pattern. Okay, for some of you, an example might have leaped to mind. For others, it might have been a little more difficult to think of something, or somewhere in between, and all is okay. The premise is just understanding that our behaviors come from somewhere. And this is a tool to slow us down to think about, where did our patterns come from and why. All right, next slide, Trina. Ooh, a bit of data. Okay. Behavioral scientists once thought that our behavior came from our conscious thoughts. They now realize that about 90% of our behavior comes from thoughts that are automatic, unconscious, and unintentional. Automatic, unconscious, and intentional. So unconscious bias is our unconscious ideas that have been formed by our culture, our life experiences, and by our mind's attempt to make sense of the world. And so guess what? Unconscious bias is not inherently cruel or damaging. It is part of our biological makeup. The challenge is rank ordering as better or worse. That is fundamentally the problem. We filter out some things and let others in. It's our mind's natural way to make sense of the chaos. So we take shortcuts to deal with the multitude of data that we are bombarded with. So let's absolutely thank our brains for trying to be helpful. And yet listen to this double negative. The objective is not to not be biased. Did y'all catch that? The objective is not to not be biased. And yet, because of the social context we're in, a lot of the implicit messages that we take in causes sorting to reinforce racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia. and more. And so the practice is to slow way down and get way more curious. And the action is to parse or sort differently, leveraging our ability to slow down and with intention to notice our bias and make conscious choices in alignment with our goals, our intentions, and our values. Okay, can you layer on, Trina?
Absolutely. So we want to make sure to give you a bunch of tangible things that you can be trying in your real life with your colleagues in your industry. And so we invite you to engage in a practice, and we're going to make sure that we are sharing the slides. So you've got this, so you don't have to take super fast notes. But here's a practice that we invite you into. Practice discussing your patterns and the meaning that you make out of them, right? What they mean to you, what they signify. Because part of what we need to do, if we remember that cultural iceberg, is bring those things that are lurking underneath the waterline up to the surface. So rather than just think about them, practice actually being in conversation. Here is the way that I seek out sources. Here is how I'm deciding on images or layout. Here is my pattern for how I get to a strong headline, right? Whatever it is that you're engaging in, it's not just your special way. There are some patterns or some habits. So if we practice discussing them and their meaning, it opens up an opportunity to better understand, especially when a colleague or a source's patterns of meaning making are different than yours. So when we model, we create a sort of a container for other folks to share their patterns and meaning making as well. The second piece, and this goes with what Pearl said about slowing way down, is how do we discover rather than assume shared meaning? So I might just believe somewhere in my gut, and I might even call it my intuition, that this is how a community responded, or this is what this action or activity meant to a neighborhood. In reality, there's a whole lot I don't know yet. So whenever I'm leaping into assumptions, how can I work backwards and say, have I discovered or have I deduced and assumed? How much am I projecting my reaction onto other people? And have I actually done my due diligence and done the work of discovery? The third piece, and this goes along with why we wrote the session description that we did today, is around it disrupting any belief that there is such a thing as we all or surely everybody can agree. Pearl and I just don't have that lived experience, right? And sometimes to make it silly helps us remember how silly this is. So for me, it's like, I don't ever get to speak on behalf of all women how the leaked Supreme Court information landed. I'm not the queen of all women, and sure as heck, not all women feel the same way. Same thing. Pearl, even if she's being asked to, is not going to speak on behalf of all Black people. So this idea that any of us can ever be the ambassador of a whole is nuts, because it's just stripping away the truth and complexity about the richness and the mix of lived experiences that we're having. So whenever we catch ourselves saying the whole community, or everyone on this block, or all Vietnamese Americans, or every single Jewish person, and you're just like, I know better than that. Hang on a second. Why am I telling myself that there's some sort of monolith or some sort of homogeneity when it's really likely that's not the truth? So we have to resist the urge, right? Whenever we're feeling all or everybody or never or nobody. For on either sides of the spectrum, we're probably off. So it is our job to help disrupt whenever we're starting to overgeneralize and strip away complexity. So the practice is discuss out loud in front of God and everybody, discover, and disrupt. I want to show you an example. It's likely you've seen examples like this side by side, and this may be one of your worst nightmares in the field, is having sort of your work shown side by side with somebody else's. And then there really be an analysis that something has gone awry, that something feels racist or something feels sexist or something feels off or unresearched. So this is just an example, right, of an outlet talking about different acts of violence in America, right? And when we take a look at this on the left, excuse me, it says Jacob Blake had a knife in his car when he was shot by police, DOJ says. On the other side, if you have access to site, you will see suspected teen gunman Kyle Rittenhouse spotted cleaning Kenosha graffiti before shooting. And then we see different images. So how somebody who is a perpetrator and how somebody who is a victim is getting talked about, where there is allegedness, where there is certainty, what we are being drawn our attention towards, it is really important to be considering what messages are we receiving, what messages are we sharing, and how are we absolutely in the US speaking differently about people of color and white people. Some of you may be familiar with this incredible project that was done a few years ago by artist and activist Alexandra Bell. There was a series called the Counternarratives Project, and you can look it up and dig all the way in. There's a ton of really great media on the project. What Alexandra Bell did was she took time to look at a couple key articles. She decided to use just the New York Times to figure out what is and isn't being said, what is and isn't being compared, who is and isn't afforded what kind of titles. And some of the things that she noticed, right, was that very often Black, Indigenous, and people of color were named by race and white people weren't, right? Very often there is this sort of side-by-side comparison as though the power differential of somebody in a job is different than the power of somebody who is a child, right? When we think about how information gets portrayed, both visually and through the written word, we invite you to take a look and to really start to think more critically about what it is we're saying and not saying, and how wildly different our patterns become of discussing some of the most complex parts of what are patterns in the US. And so we just want to remind folks that there are options and opportunities, and we know that you all are at the forefront of trying to develop better and emerging best practices of how we can talk about things like the complexity of race and violence in the US. Here's something that's really important to hold on to. Right now, in the US, we are aware at the systemic, institutional, interpersonal, and personal levels that there is a pervasive and very strong presence and preference towards whiteness and towards masculinity. So what does that mean? The reason at Team Dynamics we zoom in on race and gender is not actually because it's hot in the news or the recent conversations. It's because right now, these are the single biggest differences making a predictive difference in health, well-being, safety, lifetime expectancy, and more. So right now, we are in this country being sorted by identity and treated differently because of that. So what we need to be more conscious of is that bias is present. So again, Pearl gave us the permission to release the belief that we can never become unbiased. That's not true. What we can do is become hyper aware and really consistent about acknowledging how all of our biases are coming together to influence our worldview. When we talk about preferences for whiteness, we're talking about preferences for whiteness as it's associated with thinking, behavior, capacity, and lightness of skin. When we talk about preferences for masculinity, we talk about in the US culturally, behaviors associated with masculinity. As a reminder, both white people and people of color can perform aspects of whiteness, and that men, women, and gender non-binary folks can all perform aspects of masculinity. So this isn't just about white people and men. This is about whiteness and masculinity as being deemed more valuable, right, than things different than whiteness and things different than masculinity. So it is our job, if we are interested in stripping back these preferences, is to acknowledge, first of all, that they're everywhere. So what can we be doing to be thinking differently about how we can communicate what it is we are seeing, experiencing, and the stories we want to tell? So here's the invitation. On the right, if you have access to sight, you see an image that has a bunch of identities that create this incredible mix. And in our world, mix can be magical. The thing we have to remember is it's not about if, but how our lived experience of this entire mix influence our response. So our response to when we see, experience, witness, or hear about violence, our response to what feels like the news or the politics of the day, our response to what we are learning is happening in the region in which we live and work, and our influence of our response about hearing about different communities that aren't like ours. So it's this reminder that we are never just one of these facets of ourselves. We are all, and they all influence every response we're having. So again, the invitation is to slow way down, and Pearl's going to give you a tool to help you do that.
Yes. So the tool, describe, interpret, evaluate. And I'm going to be a bit zippy, but this is a forever tool. Because at times, literally, our brains, our hearts, our bodies, we shift into meaning making. It zips into interpretation and evaluation, when in actuality, so many actions and behaviors can mean so many different things. So describe is what happened, what did I notice? And then how do I know that? Is it something I think, or do I know that I know? Or am I guessing? And if I'm guessing, or if I think that I know, can I slow down? And is there a way I can get to know for sure, or at least get to more knowing? And then interpret. This is about, what is the story I'm telling myself about what happened? How am I feeling about it? And evaluation is, what determination do I want to make? And then also a self-reflective piece is, and also, what is the story that I'm telling me about me? So I'm being very zippy on this. And yet, again, it's just a forever tool to slow way down. So if there's nothing else you take from me today, latch on to this. The forever practice is to notice our assumptions and not hold them as absolute truths. Get curious that it can mean multiple things. And so I really imagine, as members of the press, you have the ability to influence, to enlighten, and to practice rigorous curiosity. Trina, anything you want to layer on? And then next slide.
Yeah, as we move into the question and answer period of our time together today, we want to let you know that Pearl and I will be sharing with Rachel, who will then share out to you one of our signature tools, which is called the Team Dynamics Embodied Identity House. What it does is it helps us take an intersectional approach that's grounded in a conversation about race, again, as the single biggest difference making the difference. What does a tool like this help us do? It reminds us that identity always matters. Even at work, we are not just the top inch and a half of our body. We are not just the thinking part. We are people who are having a lived experience that is mixed across levels of meaningful identity. It's also important to remember that our experience of our mix isn't fixed. Facets of our identity for each of us experience a mix of praise, pride, and pain. Right? There are days when I love being a female CEO. There are days when it's really hard and it is not my favorite, right? So it's this reminder that we're not having a singular experience. And lastly, from moment to moment, day to day, story to story with your colleagues in different settings, we are going to feel more or less aware of certain parts of our identity over others. So we invite you to utilize the embodied identity house. We keep this near our workstations at all times to say, okay, so I'm a US born US citizen who speaks English. I've changed economic class during my lifetime. I was raised Lutheran. I'm some kind of Protestant now. I was born in 1980, have a hidden disability. I'm gay, I'm a cisgendered female, I'm Scandinavian, and I'm white. Okay, all of those things are true. So given that reality, again, not using my identities as an excuse or a weapon, how does that help me slow down and inform what I'm missing, what I'm grasping, what I need more support around to understand? So as we move into Q&A, just a reminder, there's a bunch of ways to get a hold of us and our team. We have a podcast called Behave that's entirely about workplace behavior. We have a website, teamdynamicsmn.com, that has a ton of free tools on there. And we also have a book out called Hiring Revolution, a guide to disruptive racism and sexism in hiring. So all sorts of options if you are looking for more or different support around race, gender justice issues, and the workplace. And so with that, I think Rachel is going to help us look into the chat to see what questions folks have.
Yeah, unfortunately, we like to give people a little bit of time to get to the next session. So if we have a lot of questions, I can always have those emailed to me and I can send them to you guys for a response. I do want to say thank you again to the Virginia Press Foundation for sponsoring, and thanks to Trina and Pearl for joining us and everybody for joining the session. A quick note, the winner of our $20 gift card today is Jillian Lynch. So congratulations, and we'll be notifying you via the email you registered with. And a quick note, our next session, Easy Digital Marketing Tactics and Products to Sell with Ben Booslog and Ken Campbell at Accelerant, will begin at 11 a.m. You can find the conference schedule at the VPA conference page on our website, and check your email for Zoom links. And again, if you have any questions about this wonderful session, please feel free to email me at rachelf@vpa.net. And thank you again, Trina and Pearl. It was really great.
Thank you for having us.
All right. Have a nice day, everybody. Bye-bye.